You are muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. Okay, so hi everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Vivian Chime, and I am the Africa Journalism Manager at Climate Tracker. And I want to say a big thank you for making the time to join us again today for this community hangout. This is a monthly webinar where we bring, new knowledge to our community of journalists, to help in the stories they tell, to help them improve in their coverage and also professionally. And also we have non-governmental organizations and civil societies that join us on this call monthly. So you're very much welcome. So on today's hangout, we're going to be basically talking about carbon markets and Africa's narrative. But before we start, I would like to please ask that we do not disrupt the meeting by unmuting ourselves when the speakers are speaking so we can get the most out of this meeting. And if we have any questions, we can drop them in the chat or maybe wait after the presentations to raise our hands and ask our questions. We're going to take a picture 30 minutes after the first presentation. We're going to take a group picture. So please do well to get yourself ready because we want to see your beautiful faces. So on today's conversation on carbon markets, first of all, we are here to understand what are carbon markets and why are they relevant for Africa. There's been so much conversations lately around carbon markets, and the reason is because the underlying factor here is climate finance. Because when we go for most of our international conferences, and even regional conferences like the Africa Climate Summit that just ended, there's so much conversation around climate finance. Climate finance is needed for this, is needed for mitigation, is needed for adaptation, is needed for tackling climate change basically. And Western leaders and of course our African leaders as well have been pushing for carbon markets as a critical tool to mobilizing the finance that Africa as well as other developing countries need to be able to tackle climate change. So we decided to bring this to our community so we can have this conversation and really understand why are our leaders pushing for this initiative, and why are civil society organizations saying, oh, these are false solutions, and if they're as good as they claim, why is there like conflicting views on the need for carbon markets? And so joining us on this conversation today is Dr. Fadel Kabal, who is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and is also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. We also have David Njagi, who is a science journalist. I hope I've not mispronounced any of these names. So today we have Dr. Fadel Kabab, who is going to be giving us the first presentation. Dr. Fadel Kabab is an associate professor of economics at Denison University, and he's the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Dr. Fadel has recently served as Under Secretary General for Financing for Development at the Organization of Southern Cooperation in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Dr. Kabal is an expert on designing public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global south, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. His recent work focuses on just transition, climate finance, and transforming the global trade, finance, and investment architecture. He is currently based in Nairobi, Kenya, and is working on climate finance and development policies in Africa. Thank you so much, Dr. Kabab, for joining us. Please to go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start this conversation with a very simple statement about why we're here and why we're addressing the very issue of carbon markets. So the obvious problem is emissions, carbon emissions. And presumably carbon markets and carbon trading is supposed to be a sophisticated market mechanism that will use market incentives and market structures to help us tackle the climate crisis. So when you look at the spectrum of solutions that have been discussed on the climate finance over the last few years, it seems to me that everything else almost has been filtered out, and we're left now with the conviction, both from the global north and unfortunately from the global south side, we're left with this conviction that governments who have been responsible for historic emissions are essentially saying they will not contribute to um, climate finance in any significant way. So, who's going to contribute? It's going to be markets via carbon credits. It's going to be philanthropists and foundations. And it's going to be financial institutions, again, using market mechanisms to help the global south and the rest of the world finance this transition. So that is the reality of where governments have essentially settled, unfortunately, on this. So, okay, so let's look at carbon markets then. Let's see if this will help us um, produce the impact at scale that the world is hoping it will produce. So, what is a carbon credit essentially? From the polluter's perspective, the polluter is now required, in some cases not required, voluntarily, opting to purchase a carbon credit from somebody or from a country that is doing something positive in helping reducing carbon emissions, so carbon offsets, in other words. But from a polluter's point of view, the polluter essentially is buying a license to continue polluting. So the emissions are not going to be reduced from the polluter side. Now, the polluter has as this additional cost of doing business, right? Because you're buying carbon credit, they're costing you, thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, depending on the size of the polluter. So when a company has an additional cost of doing business, and if that particular company happens to have dominant market power in the economy, typically what companies of that size, of that market power do, they take the cost of doing business and they pass it on to their customers. So if some of their customers happen to be in the global south, it means that indirectly we end up paying for those carbon credits, meaning we end up for paying for the pollution permit that the polluter had to buy in the first place. So we haven't reduced the emissions. The polluter, the historic polluter, is able to pass on the cost of the carbon credits back to their consumers. Many of their consumers will be in the global south. But that's not the end of the story, because the process of creating carbon credits and selling them and trading them means that, like in any market structure, you have middlemen who actually facilitate those transactions, establish the market structure, and they collect commissions and fees. It doesn't matter what you're trading, whether it's carbon credits or other financial instruments, there will be people in the middle who are benefiting on the financial side, on the trading side, but also on establishing the market structure. And you've just made a handful of individuals who already make significant amounts of money a little richer in the process. So what do the local communities, say in Africa, get from establishing carbon credits or carbon markets? Well, the first thing they get is displacement, because there is a geographic area that they now have no access to. And if you're talking about communities on the front lines of climate change, communities that have nothing to do with causing the climate crisis, now they're being displaced from their ancestral land, in some cases, uh, pastoral communities that are told you have to find different means of subsistence. We've displaced people on a massive scale, and I tell you why I'm describing this as a massive scale, because the scale of carbon credits and carbon markets on the continent is unbelievably high. So if you're looking at um, the intended scale, for example, in Africa, of reducing, of using 2 gigatons a year in terms of carbon credits, it would require more than 162 million hectares of tropical reforestation, and more if non-tropical land is actually used. 162 million hectares. That's about 5% of Africa's total land mass that is designated for carbon credits to help historic polluters in the global north continue their emissions for small amounts of money. And if we're talking about um, arable land, the uh, volume will be actually more than 5% of Africa's land mass to be committed to carbon markets every year. So we're talking about territorial sovereignty on a scale that's never been seen before. And I'll give you one quick example. Many of us have been sharing this and resharing this article from Le Monde. Liberia is set to concede 10% of its territory to a Dubai-based company, middleman, to produce carbon credits and to introduce them into the market. So, a sovereign African nation dedicating 10% of its territory to a private company, foreign company, that will market its carbon credits. And in this case, Liberia is not unique. Kenya is about to start doing this on a larger scale. Malawi has been one of the leading countries in the region trying to market its forests for carbon credits. So that is, if that is not a form of neo-colonial intervention, I don't know what colonialism or neo-colonialism would be. So this is this is a serious matter of sovereignty, of territorial sovereignty, that's being, you know, pushed to the global south, the African continent in particular, as a false solution, as a dangerous distraction from the real problem, which is trying to reduce emissions in the global north, which is where the emissions need to go down. We in the global south, Africa in particular, we have no emissions to reduce. Africa's historic emissions, cumulative emissions, is less than 4% of global emissions. That's the equivalent of Spain alone. So it's not our responsibility to reduce emissions. We have other priorities in the climate space and the climate finance space to attend to. It's the responsibility of the historic polluters to do everything they can to reduce emissions. And since we're on that side, I'll give you a little bit of context in terms of where we are in this process of distraction. So as we're trying to wrap our heads around the idea of carbon markets and carbon credits in this continent and settle for it as the only climate finance option that's available to us, or the major climate finance option, we have the historic polluters in the world as a whole adding close to $1 trillion of new fossil fuel infrastructure every year. So if we understand the science, and I think most people are very clear on the science says, and I'm citing here the Production Gap report. You can look it up, productiongap.org, which is a report that was commissioned by UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program. And what the production gap shows, essentially, it's a gap between how much we're planning to extract and burn in terms of fossil fuels by 2030, 2040, etc., relative to how much we're actually allowed to extract and burn by 2030, 2040. And the gap that needs to be closed is massive. We're on track to extract and burn twice as much uh, uh, the volume of fossil fuels that we're actually allowed to extract and burn if we're going to meet the climate challenge at the 1.5 degree limit, global warming limit. So the reality of what the world is doing is that we're adding fossil fuel infrastructure, not reducing fossil fuel infrastructure. 80% of the new fossil fuel infrastructure, by the way, is in North America. So as we're being told, focus on carbon markets to, create this smoke screen of climate action, the fossil fuel industry and the historic polluters are adding new fossil fuel infrastructure. But the production gap results are telling us what we should be doing is, number one, not adding any new fossil fuel infrastructure, and number two, we should be negotiating a full scale phase out of fossil fuels with a just transition framework, and doing so rapidly, which is why I often refer to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, which is a, a treaty initiative calling on sovereign nations to sit down and negotiate this rapid phase out with just transition for workers, for communities, and especially for the global south. So that is the reality of where we are. It's a smokescreen telling us that this is a climate finance solution, delivering crumbs to developing countries, countries in Africa in particular, to allow historic polluters to purchase cheap carbon credits, cheap pollution permits, and then pass on the cost to um, to their consumers. Many of those consumers are in the global south, and making a handful of middlemen rich in the process. Um, so I don't know what else to add if this is the description of where we are. And I'm using terms like full solutions and pollution permits, and a license to pollute, and loss of territorial sovereignty intentionally, because these are the terms that we should be using when we describe this market structure. Now, if we shoot down this process of carbon credits, then we're left with the same question. How do we reduce emissions globally? And who's responsible for reducing emissions? And then how do we actually finance climate reparation? Because this is what we should be, this is the term that we should be using in the global south, as in repairing the damage that's been done. So I'll close by putting kind of a summary, um, kind of what our status is in terms of climate finance on a global scale. I'll start with one number, and that's $2 trillion. What is the $2 trillion? If you divide the world into global north and global south, and you net out all global financial transactions, trade, um, exports, imports, foreign direct investments, remittances, interest payments, debt payments, foreign aid, everything included in all global financial transactions, we find that $2 trillion are moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. So that's money moving in the wrong direction. And that number has been accelerating. That number is not new. So if we don't do anything about the global financial architecture that produced that $2 trillion number, it will be maybe $4 trillion in the next few years. So that's money moving in the wrong direction. As we're debating climate finance and saying we need money moving from the global north to the global south to help with financing adaptation and so on. So put that number, $2 trillion, side by side with a $100 billion promise from Copenhagen from 2015 that hasn't been delivered yet. And 80% of whatever was delivered is loans, which means debt traps to the global south. And then put that number with side by side with the Green Climate Fund that was established democratically. It's more democratic than other financial instruments in the global economy. Last time I checked, that fund has less than $12 billion in it, available for all the global south to share. And then put that side by side with the empty bucket that was created last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is the Loss and Damage Fund that has no cash in it. And if we are to take the statements of Mr. Kerry, John Kerry of the United States, what he said to his Congress about a month ago when he was asked about this question very directly, will the United States pay any climate reparations through the Loss and Damage Fund to developing countries? And his answer was very uh, straightforward. He said, no, the United States will not pay for climate reparations. And I think that's going to be the big battle moving into COP28. is how are we going to fund the loss and damage fund at scale? Who's going to pay into it under what formula, and who's going to benefit from it under what formula? And unfortunately, I don't see us being close to coming to a decision, but hopefully I'll be proven wrong in the next few weeks leading up to COP28. So you have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction, $100 billion promised and not delivered, a green climate fund that has peanuts in it, and a loss and damage fund that has $0 in it. And then we're told we're not going to change this financial architecture that's taking $2 trillion from the global south. Will just rely on carbon credits and carbon markets and foundations and charities to deliver climate finance, and financial institutions, maybe at concessional rates, will deliver climate finance in the form of loans, essentially, not grants, not reparations. So at this point, if you look at the full picture, you're left, to conclude that we are not taking this climate crisis seriously. We're not taking the issue of climate finance seriously in any transformative way, because we need transformation, not simple reforms. And that's where I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement in the US, where he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism." And I think in our context today, we've been served a whole menu of tranquilizing drugs that avoid the real problem, that avoid the real transformation that needs to take place. And we should be thinking in terms of radical transformation, not reform. And I underline the term radical, not in the political sense of the term, in the literal sense of the term, because what does it mean to be radical? Radical means going to the roots of the problem. And if we're not going to the roots of the problem, we're operating at the surface level. And that's exactly what superficial intervention literally means. So we are dealing with superficial interventions, tranquilizing drugs, false solutions, distractions that avoid the real work that needs to happen, which is transforming structures at their roots. And one of those structures is the fossil fuel industry that cannot be left alone in this process. The other structures are economic development traps that most of our countries in the global south have been forced into those traps. And I'm happy to engage more on the development front during the conversation. What are those types of transformations that are needed? But I thought for us to start this conversation, this should be enough content to spark some interesting questions and discussion and conversation. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kabal. That was good. That was a good foundation, because looking at it now, I see that at the end of the day, even with all the conversation and the talk around how carbon markets are good for Africa, it seems like Africa is still at the receiving end of the climate injustice, globally, and other developing countries as well. And on the issue of transforming these structures, I know recently the UK opened some more oil and gas projects, and people have been shouting about that. And I hope that this conversation helps us as journalists on this call to be able to understand how we can better report these issues as Africans who are on the receiving end. All right, so thank you so much again. We'll just move ahead to the next presentation, but I would love us to start dropping our questions for Dr. Kabab on the chat, so that at the end of this presentation, we can take all of them. So our next presentation is from David Njagi, who is a science journalist. David, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, just a brief introduction. David is a journalist who specializes in text reporting, photojournalism, with special inclination towards science reporting. He has over 10 years experience in the field of journalism, and has reported for both local and international media outlets, including Nation Media Group, Devex, Thomson Reuters Foundation, Mugabe, and BBC Future Planet, amongst others. So thank you so much, David, for coming. I would present. I'll just bring up your presentation here. Okay.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming through.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you again. I think this is an important conversation, and just to go into this conversation, I would like Vivian, please just go to the that slide, because I think Dr. Fadel has just captured most of what maybe was in the first slide. So just move to the done slide.
The last slide? Okay.
Yeah.
This one. Okay. Are we good?
So not yet. Uh, as she, she tries to bring up the slide. I just would like to say that the story of carbon markets, and it's a story that maybe should really be told by African journalists, because it affects us both as journalists, and you know um, as Africans. The reason I'm saying this is because when the when carbon trading was introduced in Africa, that's I think it was post the post millennium era, the period I think between 2005 2010. There, that's when we started hearing about carbon trading, and here the issue was actually non-profits were the ones who were mostly piloting these projects, and they were actually working with communities to see how this one works out. But the narrative has changed. It has evolved such that the story is no longer about communities. It's about companies. It's about uh, politics, geopolitics, and so then indeed the this carbon market story. It's like it has been hijacked by a section of uh, the higher group in this food chain, living communities. Just not understanding what is going on. So I'll begin by have you been able to go to the slides,
Can you see
Vivian?
my screen, David?
Yes, I can see a screen.
So, which one are you looking out for?
I'm
Because,
looking at the first one, which is giving introductions.
okay, can you see the second one now?
Not yet.
Okay. So let me stop sharing. The last slide. Let me stop sharing and then start sharing again.
Okay.
Mm.
So to begin with, I'd like maybe us to focus mostly when telling the story on carbon markets. We focus on the coming COP28 conference, because it's a real controversial conference, given that the UAE, which is one of the biggest producers of oil and gas, will be hosting this UN meeting. And you know the story there is a big story, because the UAE, like Dr. Fadel is saying, has acquired some land in places like Liberia, so that they can sequester their carbon as they continue, extracting their oil and gas. And there's also another technology which oil companies are using, that is direct air capture, where you tap carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or even from existing reserves, and then they use that same carbon dioxide to extract oil from maybe wells that run dry, and yeah, so hiding behind the narrative that maybe they can continue, extracting oil and still reduce carbon emissions by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So you see the narrative. It's like taking from Paul and taking from Paul to give John. Uh, when the UAE says that, okay, we have found a friendly way of extracting a clean way of extracting oil without uh, uh, increasing emissions by using these technologies and maybe acquiring land in Africa to sequester their carbon. It's a big story that should be told, and I don't know. I don't think any African media outlet has actually done that story. And we can begin their COP27. Those will be COP28, sorry, for those who will be going to cover the summit. You need to be asking these questions when you're in such conferences, because uh, those are the basis from which you find the story of carbon markets hidden behind business and politics. Uh, and to help you do that first, maybe you need to understand the background context of carbon markets, like I said, where the story began about carbon trading in the 2000s, past million or millennium, that decade of uh, uh, between 2001 and 2010. You just follow up that story, how the narrative evolved. uh, I think even the World Bank and was producing an annual report analyzing what maybe African communities are getting from these carbon markets, but it stopped doing so, I think, in 2012 or 2013, where I think the last report by World Bank and said communities in Africa are actually getting less than 1%. So if I was a journalist, I would be asking myself, why would an institution like World Bank stop maybe producing these reports? Yet we know it's very much involved in the climate narrative. Though we've seen some also politics playing out within the institution. You remember David Malpass, giving controversial statements about climate change, and then Sunday resigning, and then there's this new coming CEO. Yes, such, just understanding the context of the whole climate, the carbon markets narrative will help you to bring out unique stories from what is happening now. And yeah, what is happening now, because first of all, the carbon markets space is the guys, the people who do this work, the expatriates and the business people, they tend to hide it in a very complex, language. Some of the words they use there, it's very difficult to understand as a journalist. So just understanding that context will give you openings and leads on where to pick your story. And for me, what I've been doing, I don't look at the whole picture of maybe what we are being fed by global leaders and the, what do we call them, the business community. just ask yourself, how is that, maybe how would that affect me as someone who is not uh, in this piece of the big fish, but I'm actually with my people, the communities there on the ground. If you try to tell the story from that kind of angle, I think you'll be getting somewhere, rather than trying to squeeze a story from the what the big players are saying, because they actually hide it with very technical language. I remember when I first did the carbon markets story after the launch of the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative. It was so difficult to get a comment from the guests behind the initiative, and when they did that, they actually packed it in a way that you know we had to go through it, word by word, to unpack what they were actually trying to say as a response to our questions. They just they were just hiding it in very technical language. So next, I would like to talk about research and interviews. It's good to do your research. Do your research, both desktop research. Read the stories which have been done around carbon markets. Uh, read reports about what's happening about the carbon market space, and also interview as many sources as possible. Interview both sources in the policy level, the business community, and even the last mile communities like farmers, fishermen, pastoralists, and those last mile communities, to be able to come up with a unique story, which won't be biased, which readers won't feel is biased towards a certain group. And then, like I said before, you need to understand the forces influencing the carbon markets, like I said, politics, the politics of carbon markets. When Donald Trump actually trashes what science says about climate change, that climate change is as a result of mostly burning fossil fuels, another greenhouse gases emission activities. That actually uh, you know that's a good lead for you to, get comments from the leaders from your country in Africa. Ask them, what do you think about transposition on this topic on climate change and fossil fuels. Get their response, and after you get your response, just try to expand with your own research, with your own, things, context that you've gotten from your sources after interviewing them. And then there, maybe you can look for leads. You can get your lead for a story, and also take time to do proper investigation and data gathering. For me, in my experience, I've come to discover that the story about carbon markets and climate change is not a story you can do in a hurry, because if you do it in a hurry, you either end up misleading the audience, or you end up maybe doing a very biased story that maybe shines you in a bad light as a professional. Uh, just take your time to investigate and do your data gathering. Uh, try to humanize the data. Try to you know make it relate to what the most affected people uh, would like to hear about the narrative of climate change and carbon markets. Also, it's also important to have the right of reply, because on a contentious issue, like if you're doing a story about the COP28 and maybe here are non-profits and NGOs saying accusing let's say the UAE of pushing the the narrative on carbon markets, bring it in Africa. I think during the last climate summit in Kenya, the EU committed about, I don't know, $4 billion to something like that to initiate carbon projects in Africa. So and NGOs and the civil society were so angry about that because they felt these people are just hiding the the agenda for fossil fuel extraction behind the carbon behind carbon markets, such that when they promise finances, and we are talking about Africa being very indebted, you know, that would be a small screen for maybe some leaders to to be to be boxed into this system. So you as a journalist, I think you need to listen to what the civil society is saying about these people, but also try as much as possible to get comments from like uh, policymakers, from even the UAE itself, about what they think about what the civil society is saying, so that you have a balanced story instead of looking biased towards one one side. And in most cases, obviously, the policymakers on the policy issue, you'll find that they will not respond, or maybe they'll take you round and round, but still, that's a story for you, because already it looks like they are evading what they're evading a comment to comment on what maybe they are being accused of. So even if they just don't respond to maybe your questions, or when you put out there to them, they don't want to, they take you around, you just have to include their reaction to the story. Then also, I think it's also good to mention that you need to stay within your ethical space. You remember, as a journalist, the, the ethical standard that you are trained on. Just stay within that, so that uh, don't get issues with the legal professionals. So I think I don't know how much more time do I have.
David?
Yes.
Okay, you can finish this slide and then we'll move
Okay.
ahead.
Then also, when covering this carbon market space, you need to also ask yourself questions. Why the emphasis on carbon markets for climate finance? Like Dr. Fadeo said, why are they not even putting much emphasis on instruments like loss and damage fund? Why are they trying to escape from the debt for nature swaps, which is mostly driven by philanthropic institutions? You've seen the debt for nature swaps being tried in South America. That is where maybe a philanthropic institution uh, comes maybe to Kenya and works with policymakers, tells them, I'm going to uh, help you maybe offset this debt that you have, but in return you have to commit that equal amount of money to restoring a natural ecosystems. For that is, for example. So yeah, you just ask yourself, why are these other instruments not being given as much space? Then also on adaptation. Um, for a long time, I think adaptation has been working in Africa. That is where, for example, if you put water harvesting system, rainwater harvesting system, it's able to it's able to benefit lots more people than maybe a carbon trading project, which is just there. Communities are paid like $10 in a year, uh, $10 in a year for just 1 ton of carbon. That is what has been happening in my experience for a long time. So just compare. Try to to get these different different ways the offset market is being addressed, and as ask questions about why is so much emphasis on the carbon markets. So I'll leave it there for just in case there are any questions.
Thank you so much, David. So that was really good because at the end of the day, I could hear balance, balance, balance. We need to balance our stories as journalists. We need to tell it as it is. And one thing I've not started seeing more of, maybe in African newspapers, which I would want to see more of, is us as African journalists telling more of these stories about how some of the initiatives being pushed by the West and some of our leaders is not good for Africa. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. I think we got cut off for a little bit.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so yeah, right now, I would want us to just take a brief group picture so that after that we can now start taking the questions. So can we please put on our cameras? Please, can someone confirm that my audio is audible? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello. Hello. Sorry for that break in transmission. I don't know whose mic is on. Please, can we mute ourselves? I'm trying to find whose mic is on. Okay. Sorry for that little break in transmission. So let's just quickly have a photo. Let me put on my camera as well. Okay. Mm, okay. Smile. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Kabab. Thank you, David, for those wonderful presentations. I'm just going to open the floor now for anyone who has questions to please come through and ask your questions or raise your hands, and then we'll give you the floor to ask your questions, or also drop them in the chat as well. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Kabab. You spoke so much about how carbon market kind of is a disadvantage for Africa and other developing countries where this initiative is being pushed. But can you like elaborate what kind of other alternatives do we have? Because there have been so much conversations around climate finance. And from what you said, we've not had, monies coming to us as we expected. So what other alternatives can Africa and other developing countries begin to look at to generate money, the finance needed to tackle climate change on our continent?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, David, for your presentation also. I just dropped in the chat a link to this recent report that PowerShift Africa released on carbon markets, on the African Carbon Market Initiative, and it's described in the title right there, "A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing," and it has all the important arguments that journalists and everybody else should be familiar with when it comes to the dangers of carbon credits and carbon markets as a distraction from the real issues. So your question is about what are the alternatives for climate finance for adaptation. From from the African perspective, we have to ask ourselves what is the transformation needed for us to tackle the climate challenge. And a lot of this transformation happens to be simultaneously development action and also climate action. So, excuse me. I'll give you an example. When most people are looking at the external debt problem that we have in the global south, it is in reality a symptom of much deeper structural issues that need to be addressed if we're going to be successful in addressing climate change. The first one is our food deficits. So, Africa today imports 85% of its food, not by accident, but by design. So, if we invest in food sovereignty and agroecology, that's a transformative economic development policy, but it's also climate policy because we reduce the carbon footprint, we produce food locally, and so on. The second structural problem that we have is energy deficits. And here I'm including even a country like Nigeria, which is one of the biggest exporters of oil. And yet, Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline. Again, not by accident, it's by design. Nigeria actually imports gasoline that's illegal to sell in Europe. Um, so, what is the solution on this front to address the energy deficits, to deliver electricity to the 600 million people who currently don't have any access to electricity on this continent, or to deliver clean cooking technology to the 970 million people who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children. So the transformation on this front happens to be leapfrogging into renewable energy investments, which is our biggest potential on this continent. It's not fossil fuels. It's not the so-called transition fuel of natural gas. It's solar. It's wind. It's geothermal. It's hydro electric energy. So this transformation happens to be a development solution, but it's also climate solution. And when you think of the clean cooking aspect of it, it's also a gender and inequality transformation solutions. The question becomes, what kind of leapfrogging are we thinking? Are we thinking of importing the renewable energy technology from abroad and deploying it on the continent? Absolutely not. Our potential on this continent, because of the vast amount of strategic minerals that we have on the continent, we have an opportunity for industrialization. So, why is it important to think in terms of industrialization as opposed to importing technology to deploy? Because number one, we have the large market demand at scale, which is what you need for industrialization. You need economies of scale that allow you to reduce the cost per unit and improve efficiency. Number two, we have all the complementarity of resources and human capabilities on this continent. What we may lack is maybe the manufacturing capability, and that's where a Pan-African industrial vision can go out and look for actual partners, as in joint venture partners, that can bring the technological capabilities, leverage the complementarity of resources and human capabilities that we have, and use the market size at scale that we have on this continent to manufacture the renewable energy and clean cooking technology on the continent and deploy it on the continent, not for export, because there's a lot of focus these days on renewable energy for exports, especially in North Africa, and that is not a transformative solution. So This allows us to tackle the development challenges on the food front, on the energy front, and on the industrialization front, because we've been locked in this position at the bottom of the value chain, simply relying on extractive industries or low value added assembly line manufacturing. So this transforms the economic structure and allows us simultaneously to tackle climate change. And when we have a coherent vision for what this alternative development framework means, then we can use that as the lens through which we negotiate with the rest of the world, whether it's a question of debt or development or climate. This becomes the main focus of our position. So we become selective. And if any full solution is presented to us in the form of carbon markets or carbon credits or geoengineering, technologies or carbon capture and storage, if it doesn't fit into the transformative framework we designed for ourselves, then it is to be rejected, not accepted by African governments. So that's the way I think of it. And when you think of the volume of quote unquote development aid that is delivered to the continent, none of which is transformative, and most of it specifically avoids tackling these transformative issues. Then we become more selective in the form of development aid we receive from other governments, but also aid we receive from foundations and philanthropies. And this is really a process of decolonizing this development model, decolonizing philanthropy, and focusing on transformation on the development front and on the climate front.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Kabal. We have a question in the chat, but just to further ask a question from what you've already said, in terms of trying to, look at some of the transformations that we can have on different fronts on our energy and our food security, as Africa, is there a way that we could do this within ourselves rather than always going for these international aids that are not forthcoming?
There is, but it's not going to happen at the national level. So, for example, this industrialization, Pan-African industrialization that I'm discussing, it's not something that the DRC alone can do or Zambia alone can do. Because to industrialize, you need economies of scale, which means you need large markets, which none of our individual countries has. Number two, to industrialize, you need technological partnership, which we don't have on the African continent, at least not yet. So how do you leverage the large market size? You leverage the availability of resources. The only way to do it is to form a Pan-African vision for industrialization and create a single bargaining chip. Because if you're the DRC or if you're Zambia and you own a slice of that bargaining chip, a slice of the bargaining chip is worth nothing, right? So you need the full bargaining chip. And like the Prime Minister of Barbados often says, friends of all, satellites of none. In other words, we use our collective bargaining chip and go out and look for actual partners, actual friends who want to transform the continent in a good way. And those partners can be German companies, Japanese companies, Chinese, American companies, all the above combined. And that partnership is a partnership on our terms, because it's a partnership that says we don't want to buy the technology from you. We don't want to import it and then have to buy it again after 10 years when it becomes obsolete. We want to manufacture it here with the resources that we have. And that's when you begin to actually identify who's really your partner and who is not. And that takes political leadership, but also that takes media work and grassroots work to generate that coherent vision and generate that Pan-African goal with crystal clear objectives that must be delivered. And when we are, I always say, there are major economic blocks on this planet that have 100-year vision for themselves, where they want to see themselves, and they use their economic incentives, economic diplomacy to nudge everybody else to the position where they want to see them on that map. And if we don't have a coherent vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's vision. And when it comes to the role we've historically played and the role that we cannot afford to play moving forward. The role that they see us play is four things. Number one, we're the place for cheap raw materials. Number two, we're the place where they can sell their industrial output for us as consumers. Number three, we're the place for low cost exotic tourist destinations. And number four, we are the place where obsolete technologies and assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global north is delivered to us as development, as technical assistant, as partnerships. And those four roles that we've played, those are colonial roles and have been used also during the post-colonial era. And that role cannot be the role that Africa plays moving forward if we're going to rebalance the global economy and tackle the major crises that we're dealing with. So, who's going to give us a better role to play? Nobody's going to give us a better role to play. We have to define for ourselves what is the vision that we want for the continent, how we use our collective position to reposition ourselves into that global map, and then demand, as in demanding reparations, both financial reparations, technological reparations, as in transfer of technology, debt cancellation, debt for debts that have been paid many times over, and that's how you assert your position on the global stage. But it's not going to be delivered to us by anybody else. It has to be an African vision and an African unity behind that vision.
Thank you so much, doctors. Yeah, so I'm, in terms of defining our vision and trying to assert ourselves, I think that's what we kind of already started doing with the Africa Climate Summit recently, and I hope that it just gets better as the years go by. So we have a question here from Christabel Chikwikwi. How does Africa account on the changing landscape of the renewable energy supply chain spotlight bottlenecks? How does Africa account on the changing landscape of the renewable energy supply chain spotlight bottlenecks? Yeah.
Well, the answer is very simple. Unfortunately, we're still at the bottom of the supply chain, especially when it comes to solar and wind. We are still essentially exporting minerals, lightly processed minerals that go into a global supply chain for producing solar panels and wind turbines, in either in Germany or in China or other parts of the world. Um, the um, uh, the recent decisions by Zambia, the DRC, and a few other exporters of minerals signals a change in that direction, a change that requires a lot of technological cooperation from the global north, um, and that is yet to unfold. I'll give you an example. Um, there's an alliance or an organization called the Critical Minerals Alliance, which sounds like the Critical Minerals Club, although it's been described as the club. And that's not the club of the selling countries, that's the club of the buyers. So the buyers club, which is mostly the US, Europe, Japan, and so on. It doesn't include China, actually. And it's a geopolitical attempt to divert critical mineral supplies towards the West, away from China, because China controls more than 70% of the critical minerals processing that goes into the global supply chain. So we, as the owners of critical minerals, it's time for us to form our club, the Critical Minerals Club. That is the sellers club, and it's not just to control prices and to influence prices. That's part of it, but to strategically use and deploy the critical minerals for industrialization, for transformation on the continent. Related to this question, maybe is also the question of um, financial investments in renewables. The continent attracts less than 2% of investments in renewables, when we actually have the biggest potential for renewable energy production. And a lot of that finance is in the form of loans. So we're not even close to tapping into the massive potential that we have in terms of actual production of renewable energy, or deployment of renewable energy manufacturing technology on the continent. But that's what the goal and the target should be focused on.
Okay, thank you so much, Doctor. I hope, Christabel, you got value for your question. We have one. Okay, I think Razan's hand has been up. Can you unmute and ask your question, please? Razan, are you there? Okay. So another question in the chat is from Abdul Hamid Tahir. He said, "How do we analyze or measure the effectiveness of carbon capture methods?" Razan?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes, we can hear
sorry
you now.
about. Yes, thank you for the opportunity. And to Adele, since you came and spoke to us in Nairobi, I've been thinking a lot about the questions you've been asking, and also what is it that that one can do to push the needle, because the conversation seems to be the same conversation round and round and around. But also, it was very interesting in this, and I'm not a journalist, and I understand that this is about journalists. Is what is the role of the media? Because obviously we support the media in wanting to tell these stories and wanting to also inform the public so that they can take better action. And it was just interesting. I asked this question now because I think it was Vivian who said that we started with this vision in Nairobi, but there's different feelings about that Nairobi summit and what came out of that, and that it doesn't necessarily represent Africa's vision, and that it actually was selling Africa more than representing this new vision for Africa. So, how do we move the needle in terms of proceeding so that we don't come to COP29 waiting for that COP, because it's a finance COP, to eventually want to shift things, but already start now? We know what the issues are. How do we begin to shift? How do we begin to tell the story differently? How do we begin to invest differently? How do we begin to lobby and advocate in a different way? Okay, I'll stop at that point. Thanks.
Thank you, Razan. Um, you're touching on all the important questions, and I'll start with the role of journalists in this, since there are a lot of journalists on this call. I think journalists play a critical role here, because you're in the middle of the public discourse, helping engage with policymakers, who are major audience of journalism here, but the millions of people, the general public that relies on the media to facilitate the public discourse, simplify complicated policy issues for them to understand in a clear and balanced and unbiased way, so that the public can make informed decisions when it comes to voting, when it comes to supporting initiatives, or when it comes to rejecting initiatives that are presented to us. So uh, for a long time, the concept of carbon markets have been absent from the media discourse, from the public discourse, and eventually was just accepted as fait accompli, as this is a solution, it's a win-win for everybody, which outraged many of us in the research community to see this very rapid hijacking of the public discourse, and shoving this quote unquote solution in the African discourse in particular, without any critical reflection. But I think that's the reason we're having this call today, is because that is changing, because quite a few journalists actually recognize that this is a dangerous it's a dangerous way to engage in public discourse when the conversation is hijacked by one particular narrative, and avoids addressing it from a critical perspective. And here I want to highlight something that relates to one of the questions in the chat, which is, do these things actually work? Like the actual companies that are buying carbon credits that are supposed to be offset by projects in the global south. And here I'd like to recognize this important article that was published in The Guardian on September 19th, called Top Carbon Offset Projects May Not Cut Planet Heating Emissions. And what this investigation did is looked at the top 50 projects that are often um, touted as the best carbon emission offsetting projects in the world. And what this investigation did, they looked at the top 50 projects and found that essentially the entire thing is a greenwashing exercise. And I'll give you some of the numbers here. 39 of the 50 projects, that is 78%, were categorized as likely junk. In other words, they're actually not reducing emissions. Another 16% looked very problematic, and that's a generous description. And the remaining 6% of the projects could not be determined, whether they were actually contributing in a positive way or not. So essentially, the entire edifice of this thing we call carbon markets is a greenwashing exercise, while the polluters continue to buy permits and increase their emissions. And one of the journalists working on the space last week sent me some statistics looking at the largest buyers of carbon credits. They have actually essentially stopped buying carbon credits earlier this year, because they too discovered that the carbon offsets that they were buying initially for PR purposes, because it looked great. They were getting a lot of positive PR. Oh, look, you're paying for these carbon offsets, and you're helping a project in the global south to reduce emissions and all of that. Now all of that is backfiring on them, and it's actually producing negative publicity, because everybody's recognizing that you're a historic polluter and you're buying a pollution permit, and the projects that you're investing in, presumably in the global south, are greenwashing projects. So now they're moving away from it, and they're not even bothering with buying the pollution permits anymore, because they don't have to.
Yeah,
So
and
I'll close with going back to Razan's question, which is on the climate summit. I'll say just one thing. Let's read the Nairobi Declaration side by side with the People's Declaration, and you'll see the gap in ambitions, the gap in coherence between what our governments declared in Nairobi and what civil society has clearly demanded. And we can start the conversation from there. See which one is more coherent and ambitious and transformative. And if it is, then ask ourselves, why is this gap between what civil society, grassroots organizations have declared and committed to versus where our governments are? And then let's also not forget that, yes, it was an Africa Climate Summit, but it was, there was a lot of external pressure and interference in the way the summit was organized, and that is problematic, because we wanted to invite the rest of the world to witness our ambition, not come veto our ambitions as Africans, and that needs to change in the next iteration of the summit in 2 years, and that whole process needs to teach us something about forming a joint African position when we go to these summits, whether it's an African summit or a COP summit, because it matters what that unity is and what the coherence of our position is. And when you read the Nairobi Declaration, yes, it has some important statements, but it's mixed up with false solutions like carbon market, and it's mixed up with terminology that is actually counterproductive, like a focus on food security rather than food sovereignty, which is the transformative concept is food sovereignty. food security is a post-colonial concept that was invented and got us into the structural trap of having to import today 85% of our food. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and I think
Okay.
just to respond to Razan on the role of the media, I would like maybe to add that it's very important for civil society organizations to keep the media engaged in this conversation. There are things called like press releases, keep the media engaged, updated. Doesn't have to be a story when you send a press release, but keeping them updated on what is happening. Just like Fadel says, there came a time when the carbon markets story just disappeared. The problem with that is that you find that most civil societies just engage the media when maybe like there's a big event like COP28, but within that span, within the span of a whole year, they've never been in conversation in the media. So um, you just need to keep the media engaged, just update them on what is happening, and this conversation will not go away. If you send me a press release, keep sending me a press release. I'll keep it just to be to even a story can build up from those press releases. But if you just appear once in a year and then disappear, you don't expect maybe the media. You can't blame really the media for not keeping the narrative alive. Yeah, that's my contribution.
Thank you so much, David and Dr. Kabab. We still have some questions in the chat. That of Abdul Hamid. 3 questions. He says, how do we analyze our measure the effectiveness of carbon capture methods? The second one, what are the key steps and processes involved in generating carbon credits? And could you provide some information on the current cost of carbon credits per metric ton? Maybe you take them one after the other.
Yes. Yeah, so the first one I sort of answered when I replied to Razan's question. You simply discuss the effectiveness of these things by auditing projects that actually claim to to generate the offsets needed, and that's exactly what the Guardian investigation did, and essentially concluded that the entire process is a greenwashing exercise. And that is for the top 50 projects that are often touted as the model for carbon market and carbon offsets. So to me, that nullifies the whole conversation and puts in question the whole process. The second question, which trying to find here in the chat, what are the key steps and processes involved in generating carbon credits? That's essentially trying to find the relevant reforestation project, for example, or carbon reducing project somewhere in the global south, whether it's conservation of forests or reforestation, and establishing the legal framework for generating carbon credits and then pricing them. And this has been part of the problem, because Africa in particular has been the place for the cheapest carbon credits, and that answers the third question. And the price depends on how difficult or how expensive it is to actually decarbonize or remove carbon. So there's a difference between planting trees in a forest, which reduces carbon emissions, versus going to a cement factory that is emitting a massive amount of CO2 and trying to decarbonize that particular factory. So it's much more expensive technology that needs to be installed to reduce emissions. So the price of carbon credits from decarbonizing a cement factory will be much more expensive than the price of carbon credits generated from a reforestation project, for instance. And the prices can range anywhere from $5 a metric ton to more than $100 in some cases, and it depends on the nature of the project. So I hope that answers the question. But to me, getting the price right is not the problem here. It's the entire framework that is questionable, and that's a generous description. Thank you.
Truly, truly. Thank you, Doctor. So, I think that kind of also speaks to the next question by Raphael, which says, how can Africa achieve the Pan African goal when majority leaders are worshippers of Western powers? Can this goal be fully achieved while African countries even fail to implement policies they themselves create?
A very good question. Is this a rhetorical question, though? Um, so I think we have no choice. The process is the process. If we're going to have a Pan-African vision for industrialization, that process has to come both from the grassroots, from civil society, which I think we have that momentum in civil society, but it also has to come from the top. There has to be political leadership, and we see, you know, moments of clarity, let's call them this, moments of clarity in political leadership on the continent, that need to be amplified and need to be made more coherent, not at the national level, but on a regional, sub-regional, ideally continental level. So, for example, in the lead up to the Nairobi summit a few weeks ago, 2 weeks prior, there was the African um, ministerial conference on the environment in Addis, which did generate more of a coherent, united position on climate, on development, on restructuring the global financial architecture, on the use of strategic minerals on the continent. And the hope was that whatever was built in that meeting in Addis was going to be amplified and made more coherent and clear to the rest of the world in Nairobi, but that didn't happen, unfortunately. So we have to go back and study that particular process and ask ourselves, and maybe this is what journalists should be doing, ask ourselves, why is it that we came close to a very strong, coherent vision just a few days before the climate summit um, in Nairobi, and then all of a sudden the whole process, got turned into a contested space with lots of disagreements, and to be honest, lots of interference on the ambitions of the climate summit. And maybe that will give us the right kind of lessons to learn about why is it that we have civil society consensus, we even have ministerial consensus on a Pan-African level, and then we fail in that last mile to deliver the final punch, as they say, in this process. Maybe if we figure out what happened there, we'll be better prepared for the next round.
All right. Thank you so much, Doctor. I don't think, okay, I think one last question says, are carbon products not harmful to human health? From Christabel.
I'm not sure what the question means. Maybe I'm not reading it correctly. So maybe if
Okay.
Christabel can clarify.
Christabel, can you unmute and ask your question? Is she even here on the call? Christabel, are you there? Okay. So thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you so much, David. This has been very insightful. I don't know if any other person has questions. Um, okay, Brenda, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's a challenge and maybe a suggestion to us as journalists. I think what this needs a collaborative effort, and I think maybe what we can do is maybe produce something like material together, work together as journalists to unveil this and produce something like maybe a documentary or a collaborative article, but I think a documentary would be good before, like, preceding the COP28 on discussions on especially things like carbon credit, and maybe there are things that are coming up on the ground. So that's just my suggestion. I think it will make more sense, and maybe
Brenda, are you
some,
there?
something I was thinking. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Brenda, for that suggestion. Actually, it's a good one, and if it would be good because one of the reasons why we have this community hangouts is to bring our community of journalists together, and also because not just journalists but also civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations to collaborate and network to see how we can tell more of these African stories. And at Climate Tracker, we are also working towards seeing how we can add more value to these community hangouts in the sense that we can have these conversations and also see how we can, incentivize few journalists to be able to go out on the field and do some of these stories and these discussions that we have on the hangouts. So yeah, hang in there. Plans are in the work, and I'm sure that even as we have these conversations, more and more stories will keep coming out from these conversations. So thank you very much again. Thank you, Dr. Kabab, for coming. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. I would like to say that if you're not yet subscribed to our newsletter, I would advise that you do well to do so because we normally share opportunities from within Climate Tracker. I've dropped the link in the chat. We share opportunities within Climate Tracker. We share updates from what's happening around Africa, and also, just try to amplify the stories that our journalists do and our journalist fellows. So it would be nice if we did well to sign up to this newsletter. So thank you so much. I see Abdul Hamid sharing some links in the chat for us to connect with him. So every other person can do so as well. Dr. Kabab has also dropped his Twitter and his email. It's also good that we just collaborate and talk more because these conversations about carbon markets and climate finance can be technical. And as journalists, sometimes it can be difficult to understand. So it's good that we connect with some of these experts like Dr. Kabab, with David himself, who is doing so well in that area, to try to understand better these conversations and how to write them and how to present them to our audiences to better understand the discussions around these issues. So thank you so much again for coming, and I wish you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.